Good morning, everyone. I am Scott Lilienfeld, and I am here to introduce my good friend, George Bonanno. I'm delighted and honored to introduce George for his very well-deserved APS James McKeen Cattell Fellow Award. Real honor for me to be picked to select George. I can't think of anyone better deserving than George of this award. George received his BA from Hampshire College and his PhD from Yale University, and he's now professor of psychology at Columbia University in New York. By way of background, James McKeen Cattell strove not only to make psychology more of a rigorous science, but also to try to bring psychology to the public and to talk about the practical importance of psychology. And I can't think of anyone who is better suited on both fronts than George. As I tell my students, the finest praise one can receive as a psychologist is to, in some way or another, change the way people think. And I think George has done that and done that remarkably well. George's carefully crafted, methodologically sophisticated research has really dramatically changed the way we think, and I have to say I think, about how people typically respond to loss and trauma. For so many decades, scientific research and theory was dominated by a view, and I think we still hear this view today, that psychopathology was the modal response to loss of loved ones and traumatic events. But by using a variety of novel methods, methodologies, many of them really quite creative and rigorous, George has demonstrated that resilience in the face of devastating life events is often more the rule, really, than the exception. And he's also demonstrated the critical role of positive emotions in the recovery process and helped to differentiate adaptive responses from grief-related pathology. I and a few others have sometimes been critical of some aspects of positive psychology, but George, I think, really exemplifies the best of positive psychology and its emphasis on character strengths, and really emphasizing how certain character strengths can build resilience in the face of very powerful, often traumatic life events. More recently, George, in some, I think, very important creative work, has demonstrated that the use of any single given regulatory strategy is often less crucial for healthy adaptation than the ability to flexibly deploy different strategies in different contexts. And George is also, by the way, a really skillful communicator to the general public, and his superb 2009 book, The Other Side of Sadness, really talks a lot about this important line of research for those of you who want to learn more about it. So in summary, I'll have George come up here. George's groundbreaking work has fostered a robust understanding and appreciation of the human capacity for resilience in the face of stressors. So I am honored to present George with the Cattell Award in recognition of these important contributions. So George, come on up. Give him a hand.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, Scott.
All right,
Thank you very much. It's really an honor for me to get this award. It's a tremendous honor for me to have Scott introduce me. We met 2000, I think. I was an assistant professor, and Scott published a paper taking a very critical look at projective tests, and I'm in a clinical psychology program. And when I read that paper, I thought, my God, this is fantastic. And he did this, and it was something that really needed to be done. It was a measured, careful, critical look. And I thought it was a lesson for me that these things were possible. And I was assistant professor, but I somewhat cheekily wrote Scott and said, I love this paper. And we kind of became friends over that. And we've been friends over the years, and I've been very much always inspired by Scott's critical thinking and his way of looking at processes in clinical psychology and elsewhere, and taking a hard, critical, fair look, and that's really been inspiring to me. So it's a thrill to have Scott introduce me. I just want to say I've never actually thought about getting awards in my career. I spent most of my career not focusing on my career. I've always focused on the things I wanted to know, which is typically not the way to have a great career, actually. So in that, and it's not a way typically to win awards. So in that context, against that backdrop, this is incredibly meaningful to me to have this award. So I will launch into this talk. I begin most of my talks with illustrations like this, because these are the things that happen to us. These are things we don't want to happen, things that are painful and difficult, but they do happen with surprising frequency. Most of us go through at least one event like this, often multiple events like this, in the course of our lives. And we call these things typically traumatic events because they are poignant, they're dramatic, and they often have great psychological costs. That poignancy, that drama has driven both clinical and scientific inquiry to focus on psychological damage. And that makes perfect sense because there is psychological damage that we need to focus on. So we've developed concepts like PTSD, prolonged grief disorder, major depression, et cetera. And it's led to this kind of binary conceptualization, as Scott mentioned in his introductory remarks, that we think of these events often in terms of a binary disorder, not disorder, PTSD, not PTSD, et cetera. And that's led to lots of advances. It's led to interventions, but it's limited in crucial ways. One way it's very limited is it canonizes diagnoses. It ignores the limits of diagnostic categories. I've written a lot about this. Diagnostic categories are minimally scientific. I think that's actually maybe being generous. They're determined by committee, by argument, by opinion. I have been asked a number of times in my career to be on these committees. I don't mean to offend anybody by saying this, but I always refuse because I don't see the much science going into those things that I'm not interested in. Being in New York, we have more sway in these opinions because we're loud, but it's not of interest to me. Diagnostic categories are also arbitrary, or they feel very arbitrary. And there's tremendous heterogeneity in the symptoms. This is a paper by Isaac Gelter-Levy and Richard Bryant. Isaac was my student. He's now gone on to do really fantastic things. He's at NYU and also in a AI Cure, the company. Isaac's sitting right there. I would point at you with the laser pointer, but I think I'd blind you, right? This paper with Isaac and Richard won the Cattell Award last year. They did this really fantastic thing where they basically used binomial equations to elucidate just possible symptoms that would comprise a diagnosis. Fairly simple. For the DSM-4 for PTSD, it was about 80,000 possible symptom combinations. For the DSM-5 PTSD, which became more complicated because they added another criteria to it, it's over 600,000. That's 600,000 different possible symptom combinations for the same disorder. Now, some of those are not clinically viable, but even if you take that into consideration, it's tremendous heterogeneity for people having the same disorder. The simple binary diagnostic non-diagnosis is also overly simplistic, and it fails to account for heterogeneity in responses to potential trauma. It's a little bit like saying health is the absence of disease. We saw two people that didn't have a disease, they didn't have cardiovascular disease. We wouldn't necessarily say they were both equally healthy. We can see differences in health in people. We can see it in their performance. So if two people don't have a psychiatric disorder, it still doesn't mean they're equally healthy. If we look at this graphically, I like to look at it graphically. I use this acronym PTE, potentially traumatic event. We have a continuum of time and a continuum of adjustment, symptoms and distress. Chronic psychopathology looks something like that. So we have PTSD or depression or prolonged grief disorder. We have elevated symptoms and distress that wax and wane a little bit, but they basically stay elevated for a couple of years or so after the PTE. Everybody else, though, because we have a binary category, we have no choice but to put everybody else in the only remaining category, which is non-psychopathology. And most people don't develop these disorders after a potentially traumatic event. So everybody's in this big category, and until recently, we haven't known anything about where they are on this graph because they're only in a category that we're not looking at. And so we don't know. Are people spread out evenly? Are they bunched up near the top? Are they clustering around different spots? We didn't know that. And I would argue, and I've argued many times in my career, we can't really understand psychopathology if we don't understand the rest of responses. If we don't understand the normative response, the non-abnormal response. And we haven't understood that response in this system. I was interested always in this spot from the beginning of my career about 25 years ago. People who don't show many symptoms and distress. That was assumed to be rare, and it was often thought that people who don't show symptoms and distress, that there's something wrong with those people. And that really was quite prevalent in the literature. So for the last 25 years, I've been focusing, instead of focusing on binary categories, I'm focusing on attempting to understand the natural heterogeneity in responses to potential trauma. And a lot of this work has taken the form of prototypical trajectories of outcome that we've identified. Initially, we did this more or less by hand because we didn't have anything better to do. Sometimes we just simply printed out pieces of paper and moved them around. But more recently, in the last 10, 15 years, with the advent of computing power, we have lots of unsupervised approaches, and one of such approaches is latent growth mixture modeling, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. I published this paper in 2004 where I suggested these are pretty much the prototypical responses we see after a potential trauma. We have a lot better idea now of what these look like. We have a lot more data, and we have a better idea of what the prevalence of these different patterns are. The one I want to really call your attention to is down at the bottom of the graph, the modal response. The most common response, and in fact, the majority response in almost all the studies we do, is this trajectory we call the resilience trajectory. For lack of a better word, I kind of wish we didn't call it the resilience trajectory, but we're stuck with that word now. But this is really the most common response we see across all of these potential traumas. Now, to do this requires a lot of data. It requires data points, multiple data points. It requires data pretty much proximal to the event and then repeatedly over time. And we don't always have those kinds of data. Sometimes we want to understand these phenomena with something like cross-sectional data. So here's an example of that. This is a study I did with Sandro Galea and his colleagues. Sandro is a brilliant epidemiologist. He is was the chair of epidemiology at Columbia University. He's now moved on to other things. But this was an amazing study they did after 9/11. I still don't know how they did this, actually, because 9/11 threw the city into chaos, and they managed to get a representative sample of New Yorkers from all 5 boroughs, pretty much at 1 month, 4 months, and 6 months. New York is, by most metrics, the most diverse city in the world, yet they were able to represent that diversity. Their data matched the 2000 census pretty well. They used those data then for lots of different things, and I was very lucky to collaborate with them on a couple of projects. One of the projects we did is we looked at the prevalence of PTSD across different kinds of exposure. You can see that it waxes and wanes across different kinds of exposure, in some cases quite high. Then we looked at people who had 2 or more symptoms of PTSD, but not the disorder. And then we looked at people who had 0 or 1 symptom. We called those people resilient. Now, the question we tried to answer in this study was, what would a person who had not been exposed to a trauma look like? And that would be what a resilient person should look like. They're okay, basically. So how many symptoms do people have who haven't been exposed to trauma? The answer is not always 0. We tend to think it's 0, but it's not always 0, because we tend to think of symptoms as pieces of a disease. You have a symptom of PTSD, you've got a little bit of PTSD, but that's completely inaccurate, because symptoms are just problems. Most of us have 1 or 2 symptoms at any given time, symptoms of mental disorders, because they're just problems. When we have a lot of them, then we tend to have bigger problems, and then we can start talking about mental disorders. But having 1 or 2 symptoms is really just a normal game. And I live in New York, where they take the trash in the middle of the night and bang cans around, so not sleeping well or whatever, worried about your apartment or whatever. So there are things that we worry about. In this particular study, we wanted to define that, so we found in the normal range was 0 to 2 symptoms. There wasn't that much data to make that kind of distinction, but we were able to find that the normal range around the average is 2 symptoms of PTSD, 0 to 2 symptoms. So here we set a fairly conservative estimate of 0 to 1 symptom, just to be on the safe side, and we saw lots of resilience. But I'm showing you this to illustrate the fact that there's this arbitrariness to it if we're trying to understand these things, that we don't want that. We want to be able to go beyond that. This is a distribution of PTSD symptoms. Could be depression or a prolonged complicated bereavement disorder, whatever we want to use. We assume the data should be normal, and we assume that, and most conventional statistical approaches require this kind of normality. PTSD symptoms are never really normally distributed. That's something that's actually not that well known. especially if we're focusing only on PTSD, we're in the tail of the distribution. We're not going to know that the distribution looks like this. But in fact, it does. In fact, almost anything we measure after a potential trauma, depression or grief, look like this as well. Now, this wouldn't be such a problem if we're only focused on the disorder, but as I said, we need to understand the entire distribution to understand what happens when something goes wrong, so we need to know more. Now, if we want to understand resilience, it's not perfectly clear where we would put that marker on this graph. There's no clear, obvious point, so we need to know more about the distribution. Here are 6 distributions from different kinds of events: mass shooting, spinal cord injury, traumatic injury, spousal loss, et cetera, different kinds of outcome measures. You can see they all show that positive skew. I like to call this resilience without computation, because we do a lot of computational modeling now in my lab, and you can critique computational modeling, and people get a little bit confused by it. Sometimes it seems like it's magic. You know, now if you say machine learning, you can do anything, and it's magic, right, if you say it's machine learning. So this here you can see without really any computation at all. These are simple distributions. You can see that most people in these distributions are clustered near the bottom of the scale. Most people are showing that resilient profile. Here's one of those distributions up close. This is a PTSD symptoms 1 month after emergency surgery for traumatic injury. You can see that the distribution is not normal, fits the positive skew very nicely. You can also see something else. It's bumpy. It's multimodal. And it looks like there are different subgroups in there that we might want to identify. It looks like there's a way to identify subgroups. And now we have methods that can do this computationally. One of them we use in my lab is latent growth mixture modeling. There are other methods as well. And what this does, what it means, is that the mixture part means unique normal distributions that are latent within a non-normal distribution. You can see in the illustration, we have groups clustering together that are latent within this larger non-normal distribution. And the word growth simply means we're doing this over time, so we're really talking about something that looks like that. People are clustering together over time in a way that we can identify through a kind of a bootstrapping or a maximum likelihood approach. Here's one study where we use it. This was a study by Andrew Clark, who's an economist, and Ed Diener, very famous social psychologist, of course. And they did this paper using the national data set from Germany. They followed 17,000 people for 19 years, as the data set did, and they were interested in how life satisfaction varied in the years before and after these events. And their data are, you can see their data here at average level, and averages tell us some things, but not everything. So here's one of their data sets. This is the death of a spouse. And you can see the year before the spouse died, the life satisfaction began to drop, reached its nadir the year the spouse died, then it went back up. So we reanalyzed this data set. We found that there were 4 trajectories, 4 latent groups here embedded in this data set. And this is a better fitting model. The way the mixture modeling works is we now know this is a better fitting solution than just having the one group. This group, around 1 in 5, a little bit more than 1 in 5, 21%, showed what looked like the average, but they didn't return to baseline. So we call this a chronic grief group. This is exactly what we should see, because we know from at least, I don't know, close to a century of research on bereavement, there's always a group of people that doesn't return to baseline when there's a loss. It's a minority, but it's always a group of people that doesn't return to baseline. So we should see that group if we plot different if we look within that non-normal distribution, and that was exactly what we found. We also found that the majority, close to 60%, showed very little change in life satisfaction, just a little dip at the top. And there were a couple other patterns. This is a lot more like the thing we've been doing in the last decade. This is a traumatic injury study, single incident traumatic injury, motor vehicle crash, et cetera, taken to a level 1 trauma center requiring emergency surgery. This is all very scary for anybody. So this is a clear traumatic event. We had PTSD and depression in the hospital 1, 3, and 6 months. The fact that we had the data in the hospital was very important in this study because we wanted to get a nice proximal look at what the patterns look like. We wanted to see whether people were even showing the resilient pattern early on. Here's what the data looked like. 21.8%, again, more than 1 in 5, showed chronically elevated PTSD symptoms. So this is a group of people clustering around that line. Despite that high level of chronic level of PTSD, again, the majority, over 60%, showed that pattern of almost no symptoms. Sorry, just to show you that again, I clicked that too fast. This is a study, these data impressed me a great deal. This was a study I did with Paul Kennedy and our colleagues in Europe. And spinal cord injury is not so common, so we needed 6 different sites to get this data set. It took a long time to collect this data set. And the data were collected soon after the injury again, in the hospital, and then 3, 12, and 24 months. And there was a lot of depression in this study. These are the trajectories of depression. Spinal cord injury is a very, very depressing, potentially very depressing event. It's like 3 traumas in one. First, there's a blow to the body that's serious enough to lesion or sever the spine. So it's a very serious injury. Second, there's a period of about 10 days to 2 weeks of possible nerve regeneration. There can be a little bit of regeneration in the spine. So basically the person is immobile, probably restrained for up to 2 weeks, hoping, not being able to feel a part of their body, hoping that something will come back. I'm half Sicilian, and this would just drive me insane, right? Because I'm constantly moving. Everybody in this study was quadriplegic or paraplegic. So everybody in this study never regained at least half or more of their bodily functioning. Then there's a period, the third part is a period of a couple years of rehabilitation where the person is learning to use this body that they've now lost functioning for, learning it to use it, strengthening other parts, and learning to get back in the world. So this is very depressing. And historically, spinal cord injury was assumed to be just absolutely depressing. We found in this study there was a lot of depression, but again, the majority showed almost no depression. And this group is particular. This is a conservative estimate because we have a lot of covariates loaded in here. But this group is particularly interesting because their mean is right on that dashed line, and the dashed line is the population norm for the measure, from the normal population, from the community population. So these people in the hospital, men and women who are even right after the spinal cord injury and forward, are not any more depressed than the average person off the street. This slide shows a select bunch of studies from recent years. The studies with an asterisk come out of my lab. Other people are doing this approach now as well. And you can see lots of bad stuff on this slide. Traumatic injury, hurricane disaster, mass shootings, spinal cord injury, combat deployment, etc. And you can see across all of these studies that resilience trajectory is not only the most common, but is the majority. This was a review that we recently published. Isaac Gauther-Levy was the lead on this. Sandy Huang was a student in my lab. I don't know if she's here. Sandy, are you here? No. Sandy was involved in this, and we reviewed all the studies we could find at the time, 67 different analyses. What was interesting about this, they didn't all use the same method. There were variations of this method. Despite that, again, the majority were consistently the resilient trajectory, and the average is around 65, 66%. This study I want to show you quickly. This was a study, Isaac took the lead on this one. Again, this was a collaboration with Joe Ledoux, whose rats we were interested in. These are not New York subway rats, which I don't know what they would do. Probably take our money and run. I don't know, but these are your standard laboratory rats. And this is a textbook fear extinction study. So in this study, on the first day, the rodents come and they're shocked with a tone. And you can see that the dependent variable here is freezing behavior. They start to freeze pretty quickly, and they continue to freeze for the first 7 trials. And the second day, they come back, and they only get the tone. And they still freeze initially, and then they gradually stop freezing. It takes them about 20 trials to stop freezing. We reanalyzed these data using the mixture model, and we found that there was some variability. On the acquisition day, there were no differences, but on the extinction day, when they no longer got shocked, there were 3 distinct patterns. The majority showed very rapid extinction, that red line. There was another group, about a third, who took longer to figure it out. As on average, they went to about like the 13th, 14th trial before they started to figure out the shock doesn't hurt. I mean, the tone doesn't hurt, so they stopped freezing. And then there was a third group, about 10%, that never extinguished. They showed a lot of variability, but they kept freezing. These are rats in a cage being shocked. Not humans going about their lives being exposed to a potentially traumatic stressor, but they're showing the same kind of heterogeneity. And that really suggests that this is kind of an animal response, that this might be built into our animal response to have this variable individual differences. It might have a species-wide value. Isaac has done more studies like this and replicated this pattern in a number of other studies, so this seems quite real. Genetics, so we're trying to get at the genetics behind this. I'm not a geneticist, but I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing. We started using candidate genes, so SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which is one letter on the DNA sequence. As you know, there's lots of letters, many, many letters. DNA is really long. There's lots of DNA. And we're looking at only one letter of these polymorphisms, and for whatever reason across time, there's a polymorphism is conserved where some people have an aberrant letter, a different letter, and it's more than chance in the population. And that's a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. Most of these things, we don't know what they do. They don't seem to do anything yet, but some of them have been associated with disease or dysfunction. It's hard. We want to make more of this, I think, than there is there, because we know that these things don't, SNPs, these one little spot on a gene, not just a gene, but one little spot on a gene, doesn't function in isolation. So all of these SNPs are working together with lots of other SNPs and the SNPs that are regulating them, or the proteins that are regulating them. So an individual SNP doesn't really have much meaning, and it turns out the effects are very, very small, the effect sizes. So we did find SNPs that predicted these trajectories, but in the end we decided this probably wasn't really what we wanted and wasn't going to get us very far. So we moved on to polygenic risk scores. And these are SNPs where we have lots and lots of SNPs. There's other genetic loci. And these are then weighted across the genome to predict something like depression or cognitive decline. And even weakly associated SNPs then can form the overall score. So this seemed like a better way to go. It's reliable. It's much more reliable. The effect sizes are bigger, and we can replicate this. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell us much about mechanism. We know that there's a genetic effect, but we don't know much about what it is because there's so many loci involved. But it's useful as a proof of concept, so we wanted to continue with this. We still haven't published this yet because we're still mucking around trying to figure it out. But what we found is there are risk scores for depression and polygenic risk scores for general psychopathology, and those were nicely aligned with the trajectories. They were highest in the chronic and the emergent trajectories for depression, and they were lowest in the resilient trajectory. We also then used the probability of trajectory assignment instead of the categories because that gives us more statistical power. We could do more with it computationally. And we found in this case that the resilience trajectory was negatively associated, significantly negatively associated with these risk scores. So what this means basically, we're not going to find a risk for a risk for resilience. That wouldn't make any sense. But we can find that the resilient trajectory, or people who show the trajectory, are significantly less likely to have risk for psychopathology, and that's in fact what we're finding. So there does seem to be a genetic underpinning for this. And we're trying to do more with this computationally because there's a lot we can do and a lot's happening in that field, so we still haven't published this yet because we're trying to really work it out. I want to talk a little bit about prospective data. So prospective data are really hard to get. There's a great, Woody Allen is kind of person non grata right now, but he has a great story about prospective data that's very funny, a great little story in the past. At one point, it became very clear in order to take this work further, we really had to have prospective data. We had to figure out what was going on in the longer picture, in the wider picture. There are a number of advances and advantages to prospective data. One, we get more accurate data. We have less sampling bias. So often in these studies, these large-scale studies we do, people have told us, resilient people have told us, you don't really want me in your research because I'm fine, basically. Because the assumption is we're studying trauma, so we want people who are traumatized. And it's hard to get resilient people to stay in the study because they often think as well, I'm doing fine, so maybe it wasn't a traumatic event anyway. I shouldn't be in your research. I don't want to mess up your research. So that's anecdotal. The same token, we know that when research is conducted on traumatic events, that people who are hurting tend to be more likely to apply to or participate in that kind of research. Until recently, we weren't able to really look at this, but with the review we did, we were able to look at this. So because we had some studies in this review that were prospective. The data were already in the process of being collected before an event happened, and some were longitudinal. And what we found, exactly as the anecdotes seem to suggest, that the prospective studies had a larger level of resilience, because we weren't recruiting those people that were already in the study. And when we had to recruit people for longitudinal studies, resilient people were less likely to be in those studies. Now, there are possibly other reasons for that, but this fits the anecdotal evidence really well. Also, when we had looked at the recovery trajectory, people who were struggling and then got better, they were more prevalent in the longitudinal studies because we're recruiting them after the effect. So this really fits the idea that if we have prospective data, we get an even more accurate estimate of these trajectories, and we find that resilience is even more prevalent. The other thing about having prospective data is that we can detect novel patterns that we literally couldn't see without it. This was a bereavement study we did way back in 2002. This was a study that Camille Wortman, Jim House, and Ron Kessler at University of Michigan started. Then Randolph Ness picked it up and got this finished and made it publicly available. I was very fortunate to hook up with this group early on, and we did some nice papers together. This was, I think, the first prospective bereavement study ever published. If we didn't have the prospective data, we would have seen these three patterns. But we did have prospective data going back 3 years before the loss, and we found 5 patterns. Now, these were done in this very primitive way I mentioned earlier. These were done practically by hand. One of the trajectories we saw was pre-existing depression. Now, that's not surprising. We know that people are depressed before something happens, but we could actually identify that group very clearly from the people who became depressed afterwards. And you can see they're almost identical during bereavement, so we would have tended to lump them together. But in fact, the pre-existing depression group was a very different group of people. And it turned out that a lot of the characteristics of that group were things that people had been associating with bereavement at the time because they tended to be lumped together. The other group we saw was this group that showed this depression improvement trajectory. They were quite depressed before the loss, and they were no longer depressed afterwards. We were surprised by this initially. We've now seen this pattern in a number of different studies. Anthony Mancini, who was also a student in my lab at one point, has just published a really nice review in Psychological Bulletin on this pattern. There's always an explanation for this pattern. It's an intriguing pattern. In this case, these people were caregiving for a spouse that they didn't like, which is a tough row to hoe. Caregiving is very, very stressful, and when the loss happens, then the caregiving stress is over. Again, though, these are very different people than the resilient group, even though they look the same during bereavement. I was also very lucky to collaborate with the Millennium Cohort Study. This was the first prospective military study conducted. I guess maybe it's not luck. I kind of just bugged these people until they let me collaborate with them, because we really wanted to do this kind of work. And this study, this was about 160,000 soldiers followed before deployment and afterwards. It's still ongoing. We found the trajectory of what looked like chronic PTSD developing 6.7%. That's lower than you typically hear about in military studies, particularly this Iraq, Afghanistan, US deployments. That's because these are prospective data. So this is a more accurate assessment because the sampling bias is reduced. There are also a bunch of other really interesting methodological strengths of this study. And one of the things we could also do is we could separate out the people who were already elevated in post-traumatic stress before deployment, because there always are a few. And this was 2.2%, which is a small amount, but it's significant when you consider how large the military is. The big finding, though, we had was that the resilient trajectory was 83%. And at the time, I don't think that was well appreciated, that that's how resilient the US military is. And it makes perfect sense. The more I've learned about the military, the more sense it's made because of the amount of training involved. And they're right at the floor for PTSD symptoms. Now, not everybody liked these data. I was very naive about this. I thought people are going to just love this when we publish this. And not everybody loved this, partly because, and this is an experience I've had many times in my career, if this is not what people expected, they're not so keen on the data. And there's a lot of investment in PTSD and other type events. Some of the criticisms were, I would say, irrational, Not all of them, and some of them were really interesting. One of the criticisms we took very seriously was that we hadn't accounted for combat exposure well enough. We statistically controlled for combat exposure, but maybe that was not good enough. So we did another study recently. This study is ongoing, so now we had another data point, so it's a 9-year span. And in this study, we divided the soldiers all deployed. We divided them up into those who had significant combat exposure or no combat exposure. They were deployed, but they didn't see combat exposure. And we did what's called a known class analysis. What this is we first do the mixture modeling of the trajectories on everybody, then we add this known class variable, and we take the trajectory solution and examine it separately at the same time in the same model for both groups. We know that this improved fit, because it's statistically improved fit, so this is a better fitting model. I've overlaid the trajectory solutions on top of each other so you can see them. They're about the same with some crucial differences. Now, if both of these groups had a highly prevalent resilient trajectory that looked about the same, you can see that the no combat group had even more resilience, but the combat exposure group with significant combat exposure, they were still over 80%. So there is a difference. Combat exposure does result in a different prevalence of those two trajectories, but it's relatively small, and then the group with heavy combat exposure is still over 80%. So we're still seeing a tremendous amount of resilience. The group that developed the chronic post-traumatic stress symptom was again higher in the combat exposure group, lower in the non-combat exposure group, but they were both relatively low, and the combat exposure group was still 7.5%. Now that's a lot, and PTSD is a serious thing, but this is smaller than I think is generally understood. The group that showed the biggest difference by the combat no combat was this group, the group that had elevated PTSD symptoms before they deployed. If they saw combat exposure, they stayed that way. If they didn't see combat exposure, they showed a reduction. That's really interesting. I don't know what will come of this yet. This is not my business, in a sense, where this will go. We did another study recently on depression and heart attacks. Heart attacks cause a lot of PTSD. They cause a lot of depression. This study, we had data 4 years before, 4 years after a heart attack. We got the similar trajectory patterns that we typically see, a lot of resilience again, somewhat slightly different than in previous studies, but also somewhat similar. But we were particularly interested in this study in mortality. My colleagues up at the medical school at Columbia, Karina Davidson, Donald Edmondson, Laura Melly, who's currently a student in my lab, they've been finding for a number of years that people who are depressed after a heart attack are more likely to die. So they've increased mortality. That's very serious stuff. We don't want people dying, and we know how to treat depression, so we can do something about that. But the problem was that it wasn't clear which people. Are anybody who's depressed, people who became depressed, people who were previously depressed, or is it what is it? So the only way to really answer that question was to do this kind of mixture modeling, and when we did it, we found that this was the group that became depressed was the only group that had increased mortality, significantly increased mortality. We found the same thing in this study. This is a divorce study. This replicated an earlier study we'd done. Most people are resilient to divorce. Think twice still anyway before you do it. But some people become very depressed after divorce. Those are probably people who didn't want to be divorced. And then some people become less depressed after divorce. Those are probably people who wanted to be divorced. But again, there was this question of mortality. Dave Sabara had been finding, at the University of Arizona, had been finding for a number of years that married people live longer than divorced people. And he found this in epidemiological data and lots of other kinds of data, and it seemed like a real finding. But again, the question is, which divorced people? If you make kind of a psychoanalytic kind of, we don't know really what's going on in our lives interpretation, you might say, well, maybe resilient people, they're not really resilient. They're just kind of stuffing it down, and they're going to die more quickly because they're not really dealing with it. Or maybe you might say those people who are improving after the divorce, that's really superficial, and they're more likely to die. In fact, none of those were true. It was again this group, the group that became depressed after the divorce. Now, obviously, I don't need to tell this audience, but it doesn't mean everybody is going to die who is divorced and depressed, but this is statistical probability that it's more likely. We found it also in this study. This was a study we recently did of serious health events with discrete onset: cancer, stroke, heart disease, or lung disease. Anybody who had one of those 4 diseases in a 2-year period was in this study. We had the data again before and after. The type of event didn't seem to matter. It didn't influence the trajectory. So all of these are kind of similar in terms of their quality. Again, we found increased mortality for this group, the group that became depressed. So this is the pattern now we've seen a number of times. Becoming depressed after either a major health event or a major social stressor is increasing mortality. It takes its physical toll. And that's not that surprising, but we've seen now pretty clear evidence for that. In this study, we also we realized as we looked through this data that there were some people who had more than one of these events within a 2-year period. And so we divided the group up again into those who had only one of these events versus those who had multiple serious health events with discrete onset within the same 2-year period. And we thought, well, what will we see in terms of trajectory? So again, we did the known class analysis, where we did everybody first, and then we repeated the analysis separately for each group simultaneously in the same run. And we found that there was, again, an improved fit doing it this way. And again, the differences were small but interesting. The resilient group was almost identical, almost same prevalence. So what this is really, I thought this was particularly interesting. If people are going to be resilient for one of these major health events, they're going to be just as resilient if more than one thing happens. Now, this is only one study. This is the first time we've been able to actually look at this question, but it's very interesting. We didn't see that, though, for people who became depressed, chronic depression. If they had more than one event, they became even more depressed. So people who are becoming depressed become more depressed. People who are staying resilient to these events, it doesn't seem to make them less resilient if more than one event happens. Recently, we just did a study evaluating, now this kind of circles back to psychopathology. I've studied bereavement for most of my career off and on, and there are now 2 diagnoses for prolonged grief disorder. The DSM has one called prolonged complicated bereavement disorder, and the ICD-11, the International Classification of Disorders, just released its new version, the ICD-11, and they have the prolonged grief disorder diagnosis. So the question is, which one of these diagnoses is the diagnosis to use, and there's a lot of debate about this. So what we thought we would do in this paper, I did this with Matteo Malgaroli, a student in my lab, we thought what we would do with this is, Matteo is actually now a postdoc at NYU, we would just see how the symptom sets that comprise the disorders, because there's 2 different symptom sets. As I mentioned, these disorders are not that empirical. So people are deciding which symptoms go in each disorder, not usually by empirical criteria, but whatever a committee decides. So we decided to see, what do these symptom sets capture change as good? Because after all, we want to know about change over time for treating people. So do the symptom sets differ in how well they capture change? And the results are very clear. The DSM category of prolonged complicated bereavement disorder did not do well at all capturing change across time. We had 3 trajectories, the 3-trajectory solution. It basically was just a look at the distribution. The distribution didn't change over time. That's clearly not accurate, because we know people change. And we know some people have acute reactions and get better, and some people don't. This is pretty well established by almost any kind of criteria. The ICD-11 diagnosis, however, did a very nice job. The ICD-11 diagnosis captured the acute pattern. It also captured a group of people who were acutely grieving and then were getting worse over time. And that group was about 4 or 5%. I can't read the slide myself, 4%. And that group was in pretty bad shape. So the ICD-11 symptom set did a much better job of capturing the symptom set, not the diagnosis, but the symptom set did a much better job. So those symptoms, for whatever reason, I think those symptoms were decided by committee as well. But at least we have a way of adjudicating. The last thing I want to tell you about, just briefly, because I didn't plan to get into this in any way, is I want to predict these trajectories. And there's a lot of interest in predicting these trajectories, particularly in resilience building. And I cringe a little bit at that phrase, but it's a kind of a worthwhile idea, at least to think about, if we can think about it intelligently. often we hear about the 3 or 4 things that are really what you need to be resilient. And that would suggest we're slicing up the pie this way, but the pie doesn't look anything like that if we actually do any kind of multivariate modeling. It would look something more like this. They're mostly a lot of unique predictors with small effect sizes, lots of different things that go into play. This is a kind of an idealized slide of the different factors that we've known about for a number of years, different things that we might bring to the event, the pre-event factors, genetics, personality, beliefs, resources, the aspects of the event itself, what kind of exposure, what happened to us, what do we experience, and then things that happen in the aftermath and the way we react to it, positive motion, coping, what other kinds of exposure, et cetera. All of these different factors come into play in tiny little pieces to determine the outcome. Now that's strangely unsatisfying. And I've been trying to wrap my mind around this for a number of years, and I'm interested in this broader idea these days, as Scott mentioned this earlier, of flexibility. We've been doing research on flexibility, a concept I call regulatory flexibility, for about 10, 15 years now, I think, 15 years. And we're getting to the point now where I'm beginning to realize that flexibility is actually the much broader concept. It's a concept that kind of organizes a lot of these factors. It's kind of an overarching factor. So we're doing work in that now to try to understand this broader piece of flexibility. The more we look at flexibility, the more we realize that it's not one thing at all. It's many different pieces. It has different components that come online at different times, and it's a very complicated concept. So we're doing a lot with flexibility now as a possible way to make broader sense of these predictors, and something we can kind of hold on to and maybe understand a little bit better. We're doing a symposium Sunday on the newest research on flexibility, if anybody's interested, but that's kind of where I'm going with this work in my lab now. These are the people. This is the obligatory slide, but I'm really happy when people give me money, so I'm very happy to put this up. And these are the people that paid for this research. And I want to thank you for listening and thank APS for this wonderful award.